Good morning. Can you hear me? There we go. Good morning. I'm going to start. My name is Aaron Schakowsky. At least for a few more hours today, I'm a senior consultant with Microsoft Consulting Services. This is a presentation that actually I first did a number of years ago here at MMS. So it's revised now with System Center 2012 Configuration Manager, but still focused on maximizing security with the system, using lessons learned from a high security environment. As we go, I'm going to try and get through the deck. I've added a lot of demos and some live stuff, so I'm going to try and get through the deck. Thank you all for coming to the last session of the day, the last session of the week. If you do have questions, I've got the lights right in my eyes, so I may not be able to see hands up or something, so just grab one of the mics and certainly let me know if you have questions as I go along. A couple of the things that I want you to get away from this is that there's a lot of aspects to a config manager system. It's not just configuration manager. There's the host, there's IIS, there's SQL, there's a lot of things going on. And when you work on your security plans, you have to consider all of those aspects. And that while a lot of what I'm talking about today I learned from working in a high security environment, a lot of this, or all of this, can be used anywhere. It can be used in any environment. Certainly, a lot of environments don't have the same sort of security requirements as places that have a big focus on security, but nonetheless, you can still use a lot of what I'll talk about today to help mitigate the risks with Config Manager. So I talked about lessons learned from a high security environment, just to kind of set a baseline of understanding. What I'm talking about there is it's a disconnected network. You'll hear a bunch of different terms that are used, and really the reason for those networks is to protect the data. And typically you hear about these sort of things for government or military environments, but there's other communities that use those sorts of things as well, and perhaps you come from one of those. Briefly about some of the challenges, and hopefully you all already know some of these things. Config Manager, especially because of what it does and all of the components that come into play with the Config Manager system, is really where you see that balance of security and functionality. There's a lot of features with Config Manager and a lot of things you want to be able to do, but oftentimes the security features you add will break those. So you really see that balance come into play. And as I said, there's a lot of aspects of it, both in terms of Config Manager itself, but all the prereqs and all the supporting services underneath. Some considerations to think about as you're working on your security plan for the system. We'll talk about a few of these here today. Just a couple of brief notes. You don't always have to consider all of these things when you're working on your Config Manager security plan, because there might be another system on your network that already handles it. So for example, identity security, well, if you're using Active Directory, which you should be if you're using Config Manager, then it does a pretty good job of doing identity security. So you have to think about that in the context of Config Manager, but you don't have to worry about a lot of the things that Active Directory already does for you. Similarly with auditing and logging, if you're using Operations Manager and you're using Audit Collection Service, well, it's going to gather all that auditing data for you. So again, you still have to think about these aspects in terms of Config Manager and how it applies, but oftentimes there are other systems in the environment that will handle the specifics. Just real briefly, so again, as you're working on your security plan, you want to have a conversation with the security team. So the folks that are going to be reviewing the system, get to know them, take them out to lunch, understand who they are, understand their process. It's not an us versus them. You should be one team working towards the goal of securing the system. But if you understand the process and understand what it is they're trying to achieve, then you can help them with that process and help them, help get the system through to the point where it's ready for use on the network. So terms, like certification and accreditation, having that security team say, yeah, we're okay with this system, we'll accept whatever risks we have. Testing is a big aspect of this. Anytime you're monkeying with security settings and modifying things there, you need to test. And I'll reiterate that as we go through. I want to spend a few minutes here talking about the risk of Config Manager. This is just an overview. I'm going to go into more detail on each one of these points. So if you have a small config manager system and all you're doing is managing a couple dozen workstations for the IT department, there's a certain amount of risk associated with that. But at the end of the day, it's just some workstations and it's just the IT guys. But if you also throw into the mix servers and other types of workstations, mobile devices, if the scope of what you're managing increases, well, then the risk to the system also increases. So you have to consider, as you're working on your plans and you're deciding what level of risk you have with your system, what type of systems are you managing? Hardware and software inventory are one of the sort of core components of Config Manager and give you just a wealth of great data. The problem is that it gives you a wealth of great data. Not really a problem, but it can be a great risk for a malicious admin or an attacker. If they get access to the reporting point and be able to access all this data, well, then they have a ton of information about your environment. They'll know, what type of systems you have, what services they're running, that sort of stuff. A brief note with file collection. So if you as an admin, if you don't have access to a file share on your network, but if Config Manager is managing the server that's hosting that file, you can use Config Manager to get the file. So you got to consider those things as part of your plan and understand those sort of risks that exist with using Config Manager. With software distribution, especially with System Center 2012 now, we're thinking about it from the standpoint of application delivery and using the applications. But keep in mind, too, that it is, software distribution, in some respects, is still the ability to run a command line. That command line can be a custom script that you wrote. It can be a command that just exists on the system, like diskpart. So you can do a lot of damage just by running a simple command line without a lot of payload. OS deployment is something that typically you might not think is malicious, but you can certainly cause a denial of service, sort of. Installing Windows 7 on everything or on all servers, that could probably cause some problems. I was actually at a customer where, with the way the VMware environment was set up and using Config Manager 2007 to manage all the systems in a very large VMware environment, they actually had duplicate MAC addresses between separate vCenter instances, but one Config Manager system that was managing it all. So a team went to deploy a couple of new domain controllers. Due to the duplicate MAC addresses, they ended up redeploying to both of the front-end Exchange servers. It was not malicious, but they just inadvertently happened to cause a major outage with Exchange. Similar to software and hardware inventory, get a lot of data about the vulnerabilities across the environment. What patches are not installed, if you're using DCM, things that are out of compliance with your baselines. So this is a wealth of data for an attacker or a malicious user to be able to determine which systems are vulnerable and which ones are good targets. And with resource consumption, just being able to consume either disk space or network bandwidth by being able to push large packages around can really cause some problems. So it's definitely a risk to consider. Okay, so we've got a lot of risks. What do we do about it? One of the biggest ways to mitigate the risk is with your personnel, is with your admins. Making sure that you do a background check, make sure that they're good people, they're not going to do bad things, and making sure they're well trained. That's one of the biggest issues I see with the customers that I deal with is administrators who are given really high-level rights in Config Manager and they don't know what they're doing. So it's just a lot of oops moments. From a technical standpoint, this is really what the rest of the presentation will focus on, is going in depth on a lot of the technical settings that you can configure with the system in order to help mitigate a number of these risks. So with that, let's get into talking about host security first. Even with the OS, I'm a proponent of doing a silent custom installation, an automated install. It ensures that every server you deploy is going to be exactly the same every time. With the security teams that I've dealt with, they really like to see consistency, and they like to know that your processes are consistent as well. So if you have a big manual on how to go install a server, you do that once or twice, 3 times, each time that server might be built just a little different. But if you have an automated process, you can ensure that every single time it's going to be exactly the same. The process that I go through then when developing the security baseline is installing the system, installing all the applications, and then as I go, checking for sort of what's changed, what's deviated. And the reason for doing that is because using the Security Compliance Manager, SCM, it's a solution accelerator. There's been a number of great sessions this week on SCM. If you didn't catch any of those, go catch them on demand. Use SCM and specifically the member server security compliance baseline policy. With the new version of SCM, it's basically the same guidance that the solution accelerator security compliance team has been providing for a number of years, which was formerly known as SSLF, or the Specialized Security Limited Functionality baseline. There was also the Enterprise Client baseline. They've renamed it all. They're now using severities inside of SCM. But it's still basically the same thing. It's the same guidance. So you use that as that baseline, and that's a fixed baseline. You don't change that. You don't modify that. But then what you do is use all of those deltas that you come up with as you're installing the product. You see what changes as you install SQL and you install Config Manager. Then you add those into your delta policy. So all of your member servers have this fixed security baseline from the guidance from Microsoft. And then you add your deltas above that to deviate settings that you know are needed by your applications. And I'll show you this as we get into a demo. I'm going to show you a single delta policy for Config Manager. It's going to include everything you need for Config Manager and SQL and IIS and all that. And that's because I typically, for the customers I'm working with, end up co-locating all of the Config Manager roles on one server. If you have multiple servers hosting multiple roles, you may want to consider having a separate delta policies for those roles, especially when you get into firewall rules and those sorts of things. A brief note on, excuse me, on SCW. It's a tool that's built into Windows. It's been around, I think, since 2003. It's still there in 2008 R2. And it's a tool that's in the OS in order to lock down the system. And I'll show you a brief demo of it. The Config Manager 2007 toolkit, they included a template, an XML template, that you can import into SCW, and it will then allow you to recognize a lot of the Config Manager roles. The catch is that it's only for 2007. The System Center 2012 Configuration Manager toolkit isn't out, and there's no template available for SCW. And the 2007 version doesn't work in Server 2008 R2. So I'll still crack open the XML and show you what's in there. It's still some very useful information, even if you're not able to import it into the tool. So as I said, when installing the applications, looking through the system and seeing what's changed, the biggest area to look is in user rights assignment. That's typically where applications will make modifications, and ensuring that the service account or whatever has the necessary rights that it needs. And this is one of the key areas where that security baseline from SCM will lock down, and it'll specify things, only things like system, maybe local service, administrators, those sorts of things. So if you have a service account that needs to do certain things, SQL is a great example of that, you need to make sure to give those rights back. And so these are things that get added into that delta policy. A brief note on services. Historically, in the security community, there's been guidance to disable services you don't need. That's a common practice. Unfortunately, recently, well, maybe fortunately, recently the conventional wisdom is now that that's a bad idea. It can cause problems. Sometimes they're not seen at first, they're seen down the road. And it might get you into an unsupported state if you start disabling the default services. So it's a very argumentative topic, but you'll see some guidance that still says to disable services. SCW actually still does that. But the best practice these days is really to just leave the default services as is. So what can you do then to help add some control to the services? Well, you can make sure that your application services are in the correct state. Make sure SQL is always set to start as appropriate. Same with config manager, IIS, et cetera. Then if an admin maliciously or otherwise tweaks those services, once policy refreshes, they'll go back to where they need to be. Additionally, if you know that there are services that should never be on your config manager servers, explicitly block them in your Delta policy. This could lead down a slippery slope of adding a lot of additional services that you don't want. So think about ones that are specific to your environment that you know or will show up, and target those specifically. These are just a couple examples I threw up. Just a few more notes of things that you could potentially add into your Delta policy for config manager. The first two are not in the sort of the baseline for member servers now, but there are things to look out for. Common things that sometimes security folks will want to enforce that will break config manager systems. FIPS, the FIPS setting here, that's a very common setting. It's enabled in the baseline that I'll show you. A lot of people will deviate that. They'll disable FIPS because it usually breaks applications. A lot of applications are not built to require those level of algorithms. Config manager is, SQL is, for the most part. There's one exception that I'll show you later. And then finally, firewall rules. You want to make sure, because that baseline, that security baseline, will enforce the firewall, make sure that it's on and configured. You then need to make sure that the rules, the port rules, are added, and the best spot for that is in the config manager Delta. So, enough talk. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So hopefully you all have already seen SCM. This is a look at not the latest. I think 2.5 is the more recent, but this is version 2. And as you can see here, I have a number of the baselines already brought down. So if we look under 2008 R2, so here's the one that I've been talking about, the member server baseline. And as you can see, there are ones for other roles in your environment. For the config manager servers, this is really the one that we're going to look at. Potentially, the web server one, you could say, oh, it's got IIS, let's use that as well. But I'm just going to focus on the member server one. So you can see there's 289 settings in this one baseline. They're not all configured by default. So as we look down here, you can see here's the severity I was talking about. So the important ones are supposedly the ones that map to what used to be the SSLF. And then you can see what the default setting is, what Microsoft recommends, and then what you might have customized. So this uses a database backend. It uses SQL Express by default. So this is just installed on a workstation build. And you can make your customizations here. So if you want to modify the baseline and say, okay, you know what? This is the baseline for Microsoft, but I want to go a little bit above that. I want to add some additional things. Then you would make those changes in here. So one thing I wanted to specifically look at here was, so least privilege, and this is not sorted by name. Fun. Oh, nice. I think we're going to look at adjust memory quotas for a process, right? So you can see here how the default has a number of local service, network service, and administrators. The recommendation is the same. But because we will be enforcing that, that means that if SQL requires its service account to have that right, then unless we do a modification, unless we do a deviation in our Delta policy, SQL's not going to work. So we'll come back to this, but I wanted to point that out. Once you get everything set up here how you want it, it's very easy over here on the side to export this out to a GPO, and then you'd import that into Active Directory, and you're ready to go. As you can see, there's a number of other things here that you can export to, as well as being able to import things. If you've already have a group policy, you can import it. So SCM is a fantastic tool for managing your policies. So over here in our group policy console, you can see I've already added a number of the baseline policies. So I have the domain policy up at the top. I've added one for the domain controllers as well. And then an OU here for services with the expectation that other OUs would be there for exchange and other things. And here's that member server security compliance policy. I'm going to come back to this. So, as I was talking about, kind of the process I go through to come up with the Delta policy is looking through guidance, looking through documentation. SQL Books Online has some great documentation on user right assignments for SQL. But in some cases, for IIS and Config Manager, unfortunately, the documentation doesn't list which rights are required. So what you can do is, as you install it, you basically do a snapshot of the user rights, which is very simple. You come into the console here, you right-click, you export list. It gives you a big file list of everything. It's then a little bit of manual analysis to go through and see what's changed, or use WinDiff or something like that. But so this is already getting policy that's been modified, but you can see here for this adjust memory quotas for a process, there's some additional things that have been added here. So it's not just local service, network service administrators. So after we've installed things, we can see, oh, hey, there's other things that need this right, so need to make sure to get those added back in. Some of the guidance we can use too, as I talked about earlier, is SCW and the template. So this is inside of the 2007 toolkit, and this is that XML file, which on older versions of the OS you could import into SCW and be able to work with. Let me just open it up in IE. So you can see here it has a bunch of different roles. As we scroll down through this, you'd see management point and SLP and RP and all the roles that we know and love. For each one, it'll tell you which services it needs and which firewall rules it will need. In some cases, too, like here's the SLP, it needs IIS, so it adds the role name for web. So even without having to import this into SCW and use it there, we can crack this file and look at it and see which services you need to make sure are enabled in the correct state for each of these roles. So if you have one big policy to rule them all, then you can add all of these in. If you separate your policies out by role, then you want to make sure that they're configured appropriately, and this is some great guidance on how to do that. Certainly, again, this is for 2007. Mileage may vary with System Center 2012 Configuration Manager. For the most part, with just some basic testing I've done so far, seems to work pretty well, but I have not done a lot of in-depth testing, especially with some of the new roles. The toolkit has some documentation on how to use this too. So inside of the toolkit and the documents, I'm hoping and assuming that this will persist with System Center 2012. You can see here there's a topic right here for Security Configuration Wizard. If you go in there, it'll explain exactly what it does, what it supports, and scrolling down a little bit here, it tells you exactly how to install it, how to register it inside of SCW. SCW itself is just an administrative tool. Might be one of those you've glanced over or maybe you've used already. It's just a simple wizard that you run through. You can export policies. You can really manipulate things a lot here. Keep in mind that the policies that it's talking about here are local SCW policies. It's not a group policy object. It's not a local group policy. It'll analyze the system using its database. That would be what you would import that template into if we were able to do that. And then it just basically walks you through and it says, hey, I found these roles. We'll make sure those roles work. You can modify that if you need to. Same with the features, additional things. Here's the services. So I mentioned earlier that SCW will lock down services. You can modify this as you go through, but it will do that. And here's the example of that. So I'm not going to step through the whole wizard. It gives you a bunch more options in terms of firewall ports, registry settings, all sorts of fun stuff. The other thing with SCW is that, so it creates this sort of local SCW policy. It can also then be transformed from SEW into group policy. It has some specific requirements, and sometimes not all the settings will follow through, but that is one way to sort of take the SCW stuff and move that into group policy. Personally, what I do is I'll run through SCW, I'll look at and I'll create a group policy object, then go look at it and see what it actually did, and then analyze that and figure out, what pieces of that I want to use. Don't always use it all in its entirety. Let's flip back over to the Windows 7 box just to show. Right, so if we look at this member server policy here, you can see how it adds in a lot of stuff. From a user right assignment standpoint, we were talking about this one before. You can see here how that baseline policy that you want to apply to all of your Server 2008 R2 servers is going to lock that into that state. And that's where you want to keep that. You want to keep this baseline policy exactly as is. Let that apply to all of your Server 2008 R2 servers. And then on a service-by-service basis, create a Delta policy. That Delta policy then will have a higher precedence because it's closer down. And it'll have exactly only what you need. So here, we're adding in things for SQL, we're adding in things for IIS, making sure to keep the defaults, because again, it overwrites that. It's not additive. So these are all of those user right assignments that I showed you from the slide deck. And you can see too, I've added in the firewall rules and other settings that are specific to Config Manager. All right, so let's go back to the deck. Brief note about, about IIS. Again, silent, custom install. It gives you a consistent, repeatable process. You can customize certain aspects of that install. Make sure your custom website is there for Config Manager, the SMS web, and a custom port. You can pick the port. A brief note here. Arguably, this sort of customization, some might say, is not a security feature. Being able to use a custom port or a custom file path or things like that. I argue that these do help. While in and of themselves they may not be a security feature, you put enough of them together, and security by obscurity is not the way to go. But there are a lot of modern tools and scripts and such for generating attacks on systems that rely upon certain defaults. So they will look for services running on a certain port or things that exist in a certain location, and then we'll craft the attack accordingly. So if you move things, then those automated tools aren't going to be as successful. It's not to say that they won't work at all, because they'll just get more intelligent and they'll go look for something. They'll do a port scan, or they'll check the registry to see where something is installed as opposed to looking in the default. But in some cases, it might give you the upper edge. Again, briefly with WSUS, there is a lot more you can do with WSUS in terms of certificate authentication and things of that sort. But just as a very basic level, again, a silent custom install gives you that consistent, repeatable process, and do some customization there. The custom port for WSUS, as we all know, is not really custom. It's just not 80. If you see 8530 on your network, you know it's WSUS. But it's at least some level of customization there, and it's not using port 80. Let's move on to SQL then. So you might be seeing a theme here, using a custom install to give you a consistent, repeatable process. You can do a lot with SQL in terms of custom location, doing a named instance as opposed to the default. The footprint, you don't need a lot of the services that may get added with doing a very simple next install. SQL Engine is really all you need. SSRS if you're doing reporting. The tools and the docs are optional. I'd argue you should put those on a workstation for remote connections. But often I'll install that on the server just for convenience. SQL Agent is now required by System Center 2012 Configuration Manager, so you have to have that there. SQL Browser is not, and I'm a proponent for disabling SQL Browser. Your SQL Server I recommend the SQL Server being dedicated for System Center 2012 Configuration Manager. And since it's dedicated, no one else needs to know about it. So turn off the browser. Don't announce it out to the network or let people find it. If something needs to be able to access that database remotely and use it, then you should know about it, and you should be able to configure it appropriately. So for example, at the bottom there, like a proxy management point, it will need to be able to access the database remotely. You can do that with the browser disabled by installing the SQL native client and setting up what's called a connection alias. That basically gives it the path through to the database, the FQDN, the port number, and such. And that will allow that remote system then to be able to connect into the database. For the SQL Service account, you want to use a domain user, and then you need to set, and that's very low rights. Doesn't need any rights other than just credentials in the domain. You then have to set the SPN for Kerberos authentication, making sure to use both the NetBIOS and the FQDN. And I'll show this in a demo. You might have seen it when we were looking at the policies previously, but the idea of using a local group for user rights. So let's say you have a number of different config manager sites, each with its own SQL instance. You don't want to use the same service account across them all, because then if something happens to that account, you then lose it across all of your sites. So have multiple service accounts. Well, then you don't want to have to add each and every one of those service accounts into your group policy to give them the user rights that they need. So if you have a group that's local to all of those servers, you can add its specific service account into that local group, add the local group into the policy, and the specific account on that specific server gets the rights that it needs. I'll show that in a demo here in a second. From an auditing standpoint, at the very least, you want to make sure that you enable sort of the default success and failure, add as much as you can. The catch here is that we'll start to dump a lot of audits into the application event log. So if you are using either enterprise or data center SKU for SQL, you can do custom audits, and that gives you a lot of control over how you audit SQL. The big advantage here is that it'll pipe them into the security event log. It's a configurable option, but by putting it into the security event log, then if you're using ACS, Audit Collection Service with Ops Manager, it will pick things up out of the security event log, and you can report on them and do all sorts of good fun stuff there. If you want to get really crazy with auditing, there's the C2 or common criteria auditing in SQL, which personally I've never done, but SQL guys that I know say that it's a little crazy, but it certainly is something that can be sort of the next level up. I'll also show you how you can force encryption on connections into your database and hide the instance. By hiding the instance, you're kind of doing the same thing as disabling the browser service. It's just another way of doing kind of the same thing. And forcing encryption, it could be PKI-based, and that ensures that any connection from a remote system is using PKI-based encryption on that connection. Briefly on reporting services, again, using a named instance, and the great thing now is that with System Center 2012 Configuration Manager, a named instance is supported, whereas before you had to use the default instance, and there's some other gotchas there. So now we can use the named instance. You know, you can add SSL, use some PKI level SSL there. Service account, again, you want to make sure you have that user set up appropriately. And as I mentioned earlier with FIPS, there's one gotcha when enabling FIPS, and that's specifically with SSRS. And I'll show you in the demo how you can make that work. By default, it does not. So with that, all right, so first let's go and look at, I was telling you about this local group. So on the config manager server, we create a local group called SQL Services. You name it whatever you want, doesn't matter. Inside of that group, you add your service accounts for that site. And then in the policy, you add in this group name. You don't have to add in the user's account. You don't have to add in the main group or anything. You just add in that local group. the users on this server then, these users, will get the rights that they need. It's an easy way to set that up across your environment with kind of a hands-off approach. You don't have to go back and edit your policies each time you add a new site with a new service account. All you do is create that local group, drop the users in. Let's look briefly at, actually I can show you right here what I was talking about. So here you can see in the middle here, SQL services. So in that policy, I've already defined that local group, and they're getting those rights. So here in SQL Server Configuration Manager, you can see the services we have running. The browser has been disabled. We're using service accounts, domain service accounts on all of those services. If we go into the network configuration, under TCP/IP here, we can see setting the custom ports. So all of the dynamic ports is disabled. So when you use a named instance, by default, it will use dynamic ports. You need to make sure you're using a static port. So I've set that here to 49142. Just to make sure that every time it's using that same port, so that on your SPN, it's set that same way. If you're using connection aliases for remote systems, it's always using the same port as well. On the protocols, so if you right-click here and get properties on the protocols, here's where you see the options then to force encryption and hide the instance. Hiding the instance is effectively the same as disabling SQL browser service. When you force encryption, it requires that any client connection is using encryption. Without that, it will negotiate it and will use encryption if available. This makes sure that it has to use encryption. And then on the certificate tab, you have the option to specify a certificate. With System Center 2012 Configuration Manager, it will actually create a self-signed cert for this purpose. So this is what you're seeing here with the Config Manager SQL Server Identification Certificate. You can see it was issued by itself, so it's self-signed. You can add a PKI cert. So if you have a cert that's added to your system, PKI issued, CA issued cert, it doesn't have to be a Microsoft CA. You can add that cert, and then it's available for SQL to use. Most of the time, with the security folks that I deal with, self-signed certs are okay. They give you at least PKI certificate-based authentication or encryption or such, but PKI is best. So this gives you the ability to do that. If you do that, since you're using a domain user service account and you're forcing encryption using a PKI-based certificate, you then have to make sure that that domain service account has rights to your certificate. So if you open the certificates console for the computer, so you see we're here looking at the local computer certificates, in its personal store, so you're going to see here's that self-signed certificate we were just looking at. Here's our PKI issued cert. On that cert, there's an option to manage private keys. And here's where you add your SQL service account. You need to make sure it has read writes on that cert so that it works. So if you force encryption and add a PKI cert, you've got to do this, otherwise nothing's going to connect. All right, a brief look through SQL Management Studio at some of the things that I was talking about there. From a logins perspective, a lot of these are default things, making sure that the services have access, the service accounts. That SMS install account, we'll see that again later when we look at Config Manager itself. It's a service account that I use to install everything for a Config Manager system. And the reason I do that is that then my admin account or the user's admin account who does the install, their name isn't plastered over everything. You have control over what it has access to, and then once you're done with the install, you can go back and remove it from everything. So I haven't removed it here, just in order to show you. But typically what I would do is go back in and remove that SMS install account, and even disable it in the domain. You might be wondering who Bruno is. That's the SA. A lot of the security teams I deal with recommend renaming and disabling and setting all sorts of locks on the SA account in SQL. The argument there is that it's disabled and we're using Windows authentication only, so why does it matter? I don't think it does, but it's one of those things that, you know what, if you can appease a security guy and say, hey, look, we did this, aren't you happy? You know, it's just another little thing. It's one more thing that they can check off their list and make them happy. Right, let's look at auditing, one area of auditing. So on the server itself, you get properties on it. On the security page, have options here in the middle for auditing. I'm trying to remember, I think the default here may be failed. It's one of the first two, I think, for the default, none or failed. Moving that up to both failed and successful. Again, it'll add a lot of things into the application event log, but it's useful stuff. And here's the option then to enable C2 auditing, which is a pretty extreme level. The common criteria auditing that I mentioned, I believe is something you have to do from SQL command line. It's not something you can do inside of the GUI. If you have the enterprise or data center SKU for SQL, this is not, you can, here under the audits section, create a number of different audits and get really granular in terms of what it is you're auditing. And as I mentioned, the great thing about this is that you can send it to the security log. So that's a great advantage there. So I can't actually set one up, but I just wanted to give you a sense of where that is if you do have those level SKUs. All right, so we talked about FIPS and SSRS. Let me first show you so you believe me. All right, FIPS compliant algorithms is enabled. All right, so we're requiring the use of higher level algorithms. So in IE, we're going to go to our report manager. Oh, HTTP 500, yuck. All right. Well, report server gives some great logging. So let's go take a look at the log. Oh, let's use trace, how about? I'm using the old version of trace, but it still works. Come on. Yikes, lots of red. And if we look in here, we should see, there we go. This implementation is not part of the Windows Platform FIPS validated cryptographic algorithms. Well, that's a good clue. All right. So, this was a trick. This is not my own. There was a post on the forums with this fix. I'm actually going to show you the new version of this as opposed to the original. So I'm just going to change. Oops, let me rename that one first. Yep. And let me actually show you what I changed. So right here at the bottom of the system.web section is this one line right here, machine key. You can see here at the end how it specifies triple des. So we set that in this one file. I don't believe I have to restart a service or anything. We'll reload. Be patient. When I did the session back in January, oh, there we go, it worked. Yay. So a very simple fix. And oftentimes with FIPS, that's all it takes. A lot of people will enable FIPS and test it out and it doesn't work and they freak out and they disable FIPS. Oftentimes with various applications, it's a simple little change. It's a little config file. You specify a higher level algorithm and you can enable FIPS and it works. All right, back to, so when I did this demo back in January for another conference, that took a really long time for that page to load. So had some folks in the back who were singing the, what is it, the Girl from Ipanema song. Someone else also suggested the Jeopardy theme song, but fortunately it went a little faster today, so be thankful for that. Okay, so let's talk about Config Manager now, finally. So again, a theme here. It's a silent custom install for a consistent, repeatable process. I think we've seen that someplace before. Gives you that custom location. You can put it on a different drive, different path. Specify your custom website, your custom port. Certainly requiring the use of HTTPS is the best, the most secure way to go. That still has a high hurdle from a PKI perspective. But if you have that PKI infrastructure, I'd strongly recommend using and requiring HTTPS for your client connections. It gives you that mutual authentication, so you can ensure the clients know that they're talking to their server that they should be talking to, and the server knows that the clients that it's talking to are ones that are assigned to it. There are options now on the properties for the site that I'll show in the demo, to require signing, and you can even raise that level of signing as well to SHA-256. The catch there is that some older clients won't support SHA-256 out of the box. There are some hot fixes for certain versions of older OSs, so you got to check that first, and then also ensure that you're using encryption. Also a note about scheduling content validation. It's a new option in System Center 2012 Config Manager. Just make sure that all of your content is accurate against your source files, and you can schedule that to occur on a regular basis. It's resource intensive, but it's a great way to make sure and validate all that content and make sure that it actually is what's in the original source. This assumes that you're protecting your source files, your package sources, and that no one has gone out and made a modification on the DP. From an account perspective, I already talked briefly about the installation service account. The other accounts that you may need, there are others, but this is just some of the more common ones: the network service account, the domain join service account. These two don't need a lot of rights. The domain join account certainly will need rights to an OU to be able to either add new computers or modify existing computers. But the network access account is just a user in the domain, doesn't need any other rights. For client push, I recommend not using client push. The primary reason there is that it requires elevated rights, and it requires either applying an admin's account, which then multiple people could be using that, or you're using a service account that has elevated rights. So I'm not a big fan of that. But this is really where you see that balance of security and functionality. Client push is a great feature. It's very easy to get the client installed on things as they're discovered or on demand from the console. But there's some security concerns, so you really have to balance it in your organization and decide what's best. If you do go that way, a number of suggestions here on how to help lock down that account. A lot of these are out of the documentation, so certainly review the guide there. Make sure that your high-level service account is managed appropriately. And as it says here, cycle in a new account, change the passwords on a regular basis. It's not a set it and forget it sort of thing. You need to make sure that that's well managed if you're going to use it. Role-based access is one of the great new features. I'll do a little demo and show you, how to create new scopes, new roles, those sorts of things. At a minimum, from a user perspective, a group perspective, I recommend at least these 4 groups. Certainly in your environment, you might have more. With the 14 roles by default, there's a lot of things out of the box that you can do there. A lot of it with the operators, it may just depend upon what type of admins you have in your environment, what they do, and what rights you want to give them. So let's look at that. So first, let's go and look at the properties on our site. We've got a single site here. And yes, I'm using an older build. I'm sorry. So here you can see the ports. I'm using a custom port. So you specify those ports here in this pane, and then at the bottom, there's that one little checkbox for using a custom website. When I do the install, I actually will not install the management point or distribution point at install time. So when you install the server, I always unselect to install those roles. Come in here, check that, assuming you've already set that up in IIS, but you should have that automated as part of your consistent process. Come in here and check this website, this checkbox. In the background, it'll do what it needs to do in order to use that custom website. Once that's all set up, then you can go and add the management point, add the distribution point, add those other roles that rely upon that. Otherwise, you get into this mess of it's trying to move things around, and I've always had fits with that. So that's the process that I recommend. You can also see here's the tab for signing and encryption. If your clients support SHA-256, light up all three of these. Otherwise, just the first and the third. Yeah, that's a good question. So the question was around performance of enabling that. And you are going to see, an increase in resource usage on the server and the clients because they do have to sign and encrypt the data. If you've got older hardware, if your server does not have enough resources, it could be noticeable. It's also one of those, again, the balance of security and functionality. You could add performance under functionality. Oftentimes, in order to increase the security, that might decrease your performance slightly. Honestly, even running in a VM here, I really haven't noticed that much of an impact, but have not actually done side-by-side comparisons, looking at resource usage to see how much it is. So I've added in a few accounts here. You can see the SMS install account is still there. That's the one I used to install the site. Typically, I would go back and remove that so that it's all vestiges are removed. If we take a look at the properties on one of these, see some information here. See what roles it's assigned, so it's very easy to tell which roles it's assigned, as well as in the main pane there. And then what scope it's assigned to. So in this instance, for an administrative group, you want it to have access to everything. So the all aspect is set there. We'll come back to this in a minute, but I just wanted to give a quick overview of that. Okay, so with roles, you can see these are all the default roles. By default, you can't modify any of these default roles or export them or delete them even, but you can copy it and create a new role based on a default and then modify that. I'm not going to go through that because it's a little time intensive to go through and make all the changes. So I've already done that. Pull this one out of the oven here. You can see which users, in this case I don't have any users assigned yet, but you would be able to see which users are assigned to the role. So it's kind of the opposite of what we saw previously. And then here are all of the permissions for that role. So I don't remember which one I copied here, but then I went through and made a lot of modifications. For each category, you then have all the specific permissions, and it's very easy either to just flip it over. You can even use the Y or N on the keyboard. So I'll go ahead and change this one. I'll get it read access to the application. Like I said, you can export these. I've already done that as well. I'll show you what that looks like. It's an XML file. Not a lot of fascinating information here, but the advantage here is that if as you move between sites or just for backup purposes, being able to you go through all that work of customizing the role and modifying all the permissions, just making the export gives you a great backup if anything. Yeah, we're not anyway. Scopes. Okay, so by default, this is what you get by default. All is all. And default is just kind of a generic scope. Very easy, right-click, create security scope. I'll give it a name. You can add a description if you want. And done. Yay, we have a new scope. Okay, so now what? Well, let's go to, just because it's here, our distribution point. So not all objects in the console will have this, but a lot of them you will see the option here to set security scopes. So on our distribution point, we now have the option to add my scope for this distribution point. So I'll add in my scope. You notice all is not an option. It's because it's not really something you would give. All is all. It's everything. It's always there. All right, so we've now added that in. Come back here, we can see now that scope is in use. Okay, so now what? Great. Well, let's add a new user. So I want to give my good friend John Q. Public access. And I'm going to add him into my new role. So he just has some very basic sort of read access. So then by default, it's going to say, okay, we're going to give him this role, and we're going to give him the default scope. So that really gives access to most of the objects in the system, and all systems and all users' collections. Well, we don't want that. We want our new scope. So we're going to add a new scope. We're going to add my scope. So now we've reduced the scope of what JQ Public can do with the permissions from my role. And remember, the only thing that I've added in for my scope is distribution points. So really, all he can do now would be able to read a distribution point. That's just a very basic example of how you would modify these sort of things and put them all together. You can even get further with the granularity and say, let's say you gave, as part of my scope, we also included, collections or certain computers or something. Well, then we could say, all right, well, we also want to reduce that down. We can remove all systems. Maybe we don't want them, for whatever we have configured in the scope and the permissions that are in the role. We also want to make sure we ramp that down even further. So then we can say, well, let's focus down and make sure that he only has access to specific collections, either for a specific site, specific type of system, whatever. I only have the defaults in here, but you can see you can select either the user collections or the device collections. So hopefully this gives you a very brief sense of the granularity you can get with this in terms of adding a user, the roles that are there by default, roles that you can add, the permissions that you can modify there, and then as you use the scopes and add the scopes into different objects throughout the console, you put all that together and you can get really detailed in terms of who has access to what. I think that's the end of the demo. Okay, we're making good time here. Just a couple more slides to finish up. Again, as I said before, you want to make sure you test. Testing is key. Look at the documentation that's out there. Look at the guidance that's out there. Aside from product documentation, there's a lot of other third-party stuff that's good to review. I wouldn't go whole heart into some of those guides. They get pretty hardcore, but it's good to review them and get an understanding of what's out there. If I hadn't already said test, make sure you test. That's key. Talking with the security team, being proactive. Don't wait for them to come to you. Tell them up front. Say, hey, you know what? Here's how we had to configure IIS. You're going to find this. We wanted to let you know. So be upfront about certain things. Don't wait for them to find it in their scans. If they're a good team, they're going to find it. And it's better to be upfront with them and explain them why it is than wait for them to find something during their scans and give you a flag on a report. And again, even if you're not working in a high security environment where security is a priority, hopefully a lot of these settings, guidance is useful to you in any environment. Certainly, you may not have the requirements for a lot of these sort of things, but you can still raise the bar and help mitigate the risk of using Config Manager in your environment. Listed some links here for some of the Microsoft guidance, documentation. There's some good stuff out there. The Threats and Countermeasure Guide is pretty deep, and it goes into a lot of settings. some of which are in SCM, or maybe all of which are in SCM. But it'll also tell you, sort of like what's in SCM too, it'll tell you why. It'll tell you why you want to set a certain thing, what's the risk of not setting it, what are other things that you can do perhaps, because sometimes it's not a matter of setting one setting, you have to set a collection of settings and things work together. But then also what might break if you do set something. These are some of the additional things that I mentioned, some third-party stuff with some security guidance. A lot of these folks are already working together with Microsoft. The Solution Accelerator team that works on SCM, they work pretty closely with a lot of government and industry folks on the security guidance that you're going to find in SCM. So a lot of this third-party guidance is starting to diminish. DISA will probably always generate STIGs, and those are a little step above what you might find as the security baseline, the important severity in SCM. But a lot of the guidance, they go hand in hand, and there's a lot of overlap. So just a review of what we talked about originally, and I kind of mentioned a lot of this already on the lessons learned tab. And I hope the takeaway here is that there's a lot of things going on. It's not just config manager. There's a lot of components you have to consider, and again, it can be used in a number of different environments. I don't know if they still have prizes available yet, but please do your evaluations. If anything, it's important to me. I'm thankful that so many of you stayed here today and came to this session. I saw last session on Friday, especially with the quiz session going on, which is always popular. So I expected there to be 5 people in the back. So thank you all for coming, and please do the evals. If anything, it's good for me just to get feedback, to know if you liked it, if you hated it, if there was a specific part that you liked, add in some comments. Feel free to stop up afterwards if you have any questions or anything. This is recorded, and you can find it later in a couple of days, I think, up on the website. And if you want to contact me offline too, I can give you a card if you're interested, have any other questions. So again, thank you all for coming, and safe travels home.